Good morning, students. You must have watched the video I sent. Today we will start with the introductory lecture on this second chapter of your book Snapshots, titled The Address. It has been written by Marga Minso. So whatever we do, we should know why we are doing it. So here, let's discuss the objective of doing the chapter, the address. The objective of doing this chapter is to understand how greed belittles generosity and trust, that is, kindness on others and faith. So, we all know that trust is something, if lost, is not regained. But here, a character, Mrs. Darling, out of her greed, renews contact with Mrs. S, who trusts her, and she betrays her trust, takes all her valuable items on the pretext that she will protect them during the time of war. But her actual intention was to possess all her valuable items, that is, of Mrs. S. Now, humans exist on stream of consciousness. We all have a psychological existence also. We physically live in the present, but psychologically we move to the past, we move to the present, we think about the future. So this is what is shown in the story, that the narrator, Mrs. S. daughter, she travels back and forth in space and time psychologically. The author. Author, as I told you, is Marga Minko, is a victim of war during World War II. She has lived the vacuum, the emptiness that war creates. She has described her heart-rending, means emotional, very sad experience in her work titled The Other Side. Existentialism, that is a philosophy, a thought that talks about human existence, is a special characteristic of her work. So, existentialism is understood better when there is a struggle to exist, to live, to survive. The survivor of war in her work experienced life as meaningless as Mrs. S. daughter, the narrator of the address, feels that her life is meaningless. She doesn't require those prized possession anymore. Let's discuss the theme. The theme of the address is human predicament that follows war, means what are the effects of war on humans, means how it destroys them physically, emotionally, mentally, and it takes a lot of time to be comfortable, to normalize, to come back to life. And then there is some theme, human indifference to the suffering of their fellow beings and giving precedence to greed over compassion. So, generally, we believe ourselves to be the best creation of God, but we sometimes fail to have or show those feelings which a human should have towards a human in the time of suffering. Rather, we show a cold bloodedness. Here in the character, Mrs. Darling shows a cold bloodedness. The narrator has lost her mother, her everything. But when she comes to Mrs. Darling, she is not affected at all. And she gives more importance to greed. That means greed to possess those precious objects that she has taken deceitfully, cheatingly from her mother, that is, narrator's mother. And she gives more importance to greed over compassion. Compassion is a feeling when you notice the sufferings of other and you do wish to do something to improve upon them. As we have discussed earlier, the stream of consciousness technique has been used in this chapter, or this is the technique that Maga uses. So, stream of consciousness is a technique where characters travel back and forth in space and time, but psychologically, mentally, not physically. They do visualize, they do imagine, but it doesn't happen in reality. Let's know the characters. There are two major characters. One is the narrator, that is Mrs. S. daughter. She is quite observant, and this is reflected through many instances. For example, when she visits 46 Marconi Street, she observes that her Mrs. Dorling was wearing her mother's cardigan, and that ensures that she was at the right address. And she shows the same sense of observation while she observed burnt mark on the tablecloth. She was quite rational as she could notice that Mrs. Dorling was taking their precious objects not to protect them but to possess them. She was sensitive because she did not want to face those objects which had a connection to the past which no longer exists, that is her mother. She is strongly determined. That means when she uh, could know that all their belongings are at Mrs. Darling's house, she does not want to take them. Rather, she decides strongly to leave the place. She is suggestive. She suggests her mother not to trust Mrs. Darling blindly. And a ponderer, she keeps on thinking about the past during the story, living with her mother, their association, the importance of the objects, etc. The second character is Mrs. Darling. She is greedy. She has a feeling to possess more and more, even if she has to cheat her friend. Here she cheats Mrs. S and takes all her valuable belongings during the time of war. Selfishly kind, her kindness on Mrs. S to protect all her valuable possession was selfish because in it her selfish interest of possessing those objects was hidden. Mean, she abuses the relationship of friendship because she deceives her trust, Mrs. S. trust. Avaricious, she has greed to possess more and more. She was cruel. We are not shown that she physically tortures anyone, but there is a reflection of mental torture when she refuses to recognize uh, Mrs. S. daughter, that is the narrator, untrustworthy as she has abused the trust of her friend Mrs. S. So such people cannot be trusted. A hoarder, she kept many objects in her house. One who hoard is that he collects things unnecessarily in his house. A cheat, obviously, the one who is selfish is a cheat. She betrays the trust of Mrs. S as well as the narrator. Then there are minor characters. Mrs. S, that is narrator's mother, she lives mostly alone because the narrator used to study in the hostel. She was gullible. Gullible is one who trusts others easily. She trusts Mrs. Darling. Generous. She is kind. She allows Mrs. Darling to take everything. Duped. She was taken advantage of. She was cheated with by Mrs. Darling. Mrs. Darling, daughter permissive, she allows the narrator to get inside. Hospitable, she makes her comfortable. That is the narrator. Ostentatious, she's showy. Mrs. Darling was also ostentatious because she has decorated her room with all the valuable objects that she has taken from Mrs. S. let's discuss the key points. Narrator attempts after a war to recollect their precious objects as Mrs. Darling, that is 46 Marconi Street. You should know this address because this refers to the title, which Mrs. Darling, in the garb of kindness, means in the guise of kindness, in the position showing kindness, has cheatingly taken from her mother. Mrs. Darling refuses to recognize her. She says that she doesn't know Mrs. S. daughter, the narrator. Address was the same as the narrator was told by her mother, that is 46 Marconi Street. Mrs. Darling was wearing cardigan that belonged to narrator's mother. This was the reason that ensures the narrator that she was at the right address. So this was another assurance, means the address was an assurance, but Cardigan assured her further that she was at the right address because Mrs. Darling refused to recognize her. Let's move further. While returning to station, she recalls Mrs. Darling's visit to their house. So this is stream of consciousness. She goes in the past. That she visualizes how Mrs. Darling visiting at their house renewed their friendship. Means she re-established that bond of friendship with her mother and took all their valuable objects on the pretext, on this excuse, that she will keep them safe during war, because during war, if there is a bombardment on residential area, all things will be destroyed. Mrs. S instructs her daughter to remember the address. So this shows Mrs. S intention for recollection of all those objects. She trusted that Mrs. Darling was taking objects only to be returned safely. So this shows her gullibility. She couldn't see through the kindness of Mrs. Darling. Narrator was doubtful. This shows her rationality about Mrs. Darling's intentions. Time confirms her doubts were not without ground because Mrs. Darling refused to recognize her, that is the narrator, and doesn't return any object or show such intention. She revisits 46 Marconi Street, this time received by Mrs. Darling's daughter, notices all the objects, thinks over their waiting in vain, means objects were waiting uselessly because she would not, narrator would not come to recollect them. Was as war has killed all desire for their possession. This is the predicament that follows human war. You lose that sense of existence. You lose wish to live. Narrator feels the object could bear all these years because these were objects only. That shows how objects are in some way better than humans because they don't have feelings. Entering a room of Mrs. Darling's house, she says, I was in a room I knew and did not know. This is an important statement. Sometimes it is asked in exam and it is quite implicative. So the answer is generally not what is expected. So I was in a room, she was in a room physically. I knew, she knew which room she was in and did not know. Why she says did not know? Because in that room, the belongings which were put up as pieces of decoration belonged to them actually. For a moment, she felt she was in her own house, but she was actually in Mrs. Darling's house. So that means she was in a room she knew and did not know. As all the objects around were theirs, and for a moment she felt she was in her own house, she ultimately leaves the object. Why? Because neither the connection, her mother, was alive, nor desire to possess them. This is what has done. So it has robbed her of the desire to possess those objects and has also removed the desire of necessity. Means she feels she doesn't require them. So that is the struggle for existence. Thank you.